A heated debate is ongoing regarding the so-called grooming scandal in the UK. Reports indicate that Rotherham, amongst other places, had thousands of underage girls as victims in this tragedy. Elon Musk and others have recently brought this issue back into the spotlight after it was considered largely silenced due to the sensitive nature of these cases and the perception of racism, since the perpetrators were almost exclusively Muslim and largely of Pakistani origin. Welcome, Guy Dampier, Senior Researcher for Legatum Institute and co-creator of the documentary Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So could you give our viewers an understanding of this grooming scandal and the size of it, and why it was important for you to be a part of creating this documentary?
Definitely. So the grooming gang scandal itself dates back in terms of detection to about 2011. There was a journalist called Andrew Norfolk from The Times, and he published an article, having gone through court records in the north of England, arguing that there was a particular pattern of crimes that was occurring. And the crime was on-street grooming of girls. Most of the people doing the abuse were Pakistani or Pakistani origin, and the girls were largely white, so it was from one community against another. They were grooming the girls, quite often with younger men, and then they'd make them feel they were boyfriends or that they were friends in some way, bring them in, and then they would essentially hook them in some way, either with drugs, with alcohol, with threats against their families, and then they would pass them on to friends and family, and these abuse networks would then abuse these poor girls extensively. That 2011 article was the catalyst for a series of subsequent investigations, most of which were centered around a place called Rotherham in the north of England. It's a relatively small place. It's about 250,000 people, although a lot of those are actually spread out. So really the center where it was happening actually was an even smaller population. And the stories that came out of there were pretty horrific, and they involved the council and the police failing to do anything. Some of that was to do with fears about being seen as racist because of the nature of the offending. Some of that was to do with a certain amount of incompetence, that the girls were basically dismissed. They were troublesome, and it was just too much hassle. Some of it, there does seem to have been an element of corruption, of not wanting to look too closely at the community because it would cause all sorts of problems. And there were definitely some issues with South Yorkshire Police as well. We know of at least one corrupt police officer, probably more. And that led to an inquiry in Rotherham. The J inquiry and subsequently the Casey report into Rotherham discovered a culture of macho bullying within the council. They discovered that the police and the council had failed, and they came to the conclusion that there were about 1,400 victims in the period 1997 to 2013. So in a town of 250,000 people, 1,500 victims among the young female population is a surprisingly high amount. That's a lot of people over that period of time. And they did confirm that most of the abuse was coming from Pakistanis or people of Pakistani origin, which again was a shock because the Pakistani origin community was about 5,000 people, I think, in Rotherham. So if you assume, cut that in half to get rid of the women, you're probably talking about a pool of 2,500 people doing abuse who could have done abuse. And within that 2,500, there were, we've had multiple arrests and convictions of at least 40, 50 people, and we could probably assume it was significantly higher. So that was a chunk of the population was involved in abuse. There would not be many families in Rotherham that wouldn't have had, in the Pakistani community in Rotherham, that wouldn't have had a connection to one abuser or others. And you can see that when you look at something like Jahangir Akhtar, who was the deputy leader of the council, who was cousins with Arshid Hussain and the Hussain brothers, who were leading one of the main abuse gangs. Now, it doesn't mean he was necessarily implicated, although there were a lot of questions asked, but the fact that the deputy leader of the council could be cousins, even if it was distant cousins, and live, I think, a street or maybe 2 streets away from one of the ringleaders of abuse, shows how close-knit this whole thing could be. The revelation there'd been 1,400 victims was a bombshell. Nobody, not even the journalists who'd been looking at it, had thought it was going to be that high. And that number has subsequently been confirmed. And I believe the current tally is, they think there's about 1,500, 1,510 victims. There were other reports from other places, famously Rochdale as well, where there was a major abuse ring, and also Telford. In Telford, there was also an inquiry, and the Telford inquiry which again, smallish town in Shropshire, not a very large ethnic minority population, and yet the report found it was largely Pakistani origin people doing this, and that there were, they think, 1,000 victims as a sort of like a base level. So it's probably higher than 1,000, but 1,000 is what they feel comfortable saying. And that was the scandal. It was a huge shock, because most abuse that occurs is within families. I mean, it's within groups. In fact, most crime generally is within groups. So, most, if you're a white criminal and you get shot, the chances are you were shot by another white criminal, and so on. This was shocking because it was one group on another, and it was very clear that they were being targeted, to some degree, for their race or for being outside of the community. And the reason why this has sort of come to prominence now is because people started posting extracts from reports, official reports. I think the one that kicked it off was from the grooming gang in Oxford, which isn't something you'd assume that Oxford would have. Most people just think of Oxford, they sort of think of Harry Potter, the universities, that sort of nice, beautiful architecture. But in that lovely little place, you also had a grooming gang, and that grooming gang committed incredibly sadistic crimes. I won't describe them for the benefit of your listeners and viewers, but if they want to find them, they can find the information. It is very distressing, so I would steel yourself before you read it. And it shocked a lot of people when they saw that, because first of all, I think again, people think this kind of thing doesn't really go on. It's very hard to imagine that behind the sort of polite society and the popular image of Britain as a sort of rather pleasant land of polite people, that these sort of crimes could be going on, that they could be so serious, that the authorities could have failed to do anything. And as I say, that element of it being one community on another, it was very, very shocking. So that story continued through the 2010s, and there were more stories of grooming gangs in other places. I mentioned Oxford, but there's also Newcastle and Dewsbury and other places. There's about 50 locations overall where we think there's been some form of grooming gang. And in most of those locations, we've not had big inquiries. We've had maybe a safeguarding review, or maybe just even a police report or a court report. So we don't necessarily know the true scale of the crime. Every time they've done a major inquiry, we've had a result that was very, very high. So it's quite likely if we actually did do inquiries in all these places, we would find significantly more victims and significantly more perpetrators. But because of that, it sort of faded out over the end of the 2010s. The big reports have been done. People didn't really want to go near it. It's a very distressing subject to discuss. There's a lot of political controversy because of the issue of ethnicity. And so people sort of tried to gently move on. And there was also to some degree an attempt by some people in the authorities and some people in academia to minimize it. A lot of the thorny questions, they tried to sort of defang them. A lot of the debate became about statistics of ethnicity, and it was deliberately confused. So we're talking about a very particular form of offending. It's a form of offending that's in person. It involves members of one community preying on another, and the abuse tends to be shared out with friends and family rather than with, let's say, people who share a similar interest. So you do get white paedophile groups, but quite often white paedophile groups will be people who've connected through the internet. They have a shared interest in this sort of awful abuse. Much rarer to find people who are sharing abuse within a wider family network. Or perhaps the abuse is within one family, but it's not going to go to the cousins and the uncles and everybody else. It's a sort of source of shame within. And so there was a lot of attempts to conflate lots of these things and to defang the issue. And because it's such a controversial subject, lots of academics didn't want to go near it. Lots of politicians didn't want to go near it. There's a huge reputational risk. The original journalist from 2011 who'd done a lot of the investigations, Andrew Norfolk from the Times, he came under sustained attack by various activists from the left and various academics. And so people didn't want to get involved, and it faded out. And so when I got involved, it was because I had read the original stories at my grandmother's table, and I'd been horrified by it, and it had always stayed with me as something uniquely horrible. And I could see that over the years, memory had started to fade out, and there'd been this attempt to sort of minimize it. And at the same time, I was still seeing reports of grooming gangs happening. And I thought, well, if this stuff is still going on, this is a horrible series of crimes. It should not still be going on. And if there is a genuine issue there, then even if it's very difficult to tackle, we should discuss it. And so together with my friend Charlie Peters, who was the presenter and the other co-creator of Grooming Gangs, Britain Shame, we got together and we basically put together a sizzle reel. We went up to Rotherham, we filmed some stuff, and then we took it around town to try and get a documentary made, with the idea being that we sort of look again at the issue and we give a sort of a tougher view at a time when everyone was trying to sort of hide from it. And GB News were the people that picked up on it. They liked it, they loved it, and they gave us a budget and the ability and freedom to go and do this. And so we went out and we spoke to everybody that we could. We did as much research as we could, and we tried to sort of reopen the issue and say, look, this is still going on. Lots of the people that are involved in this have not been punished. Lots of the people who were punished are out of jail, sometimes after only doing half of their sentence or less than half of their sentence. The threat is still there. For the sake of the victims, we need to actually tackle this issue. And we were very lucky that it fell on appreciative ears. And Suella Braverman, who was the then Home Secretary, launched a grooming gang task force, which is one of the things that we called for in the film. We said, we can't leave this up to the local units. Too many of the local police forces have been implicated, either badly, or they've been implicated as failing to do anything. You can't let them mark their own homework. You've got to have a unique outside force. So the National Crime Agency is brought in. They have a grooming gang task force, and I'm very glad to say, in the first 12 months of their existence, they were involved in the arrest of 550 people. So this abuse is still going on. There are still a lot of abusers out there that need to be caught, and I'm very glad that they're doing it.
And the word disinformation has been coming up a lot in connection with this. What parts of it is being referred to as disinformation, and why?
Well, it's very difficult. Disinformation is a term I tend to be very distrustful of. There's a very technical use of it, particularly when it's used by state actors and the way that the Soviet Union used to use it. That's fair and reasonable. A lot of what people call disinformation is really, I disagree with your view, I disagree with your interpretation, or sometimes it's referring to people who are making innocent mistakes. So an example would be, what is the true number of grooming gang victims? We don't know, is the honest answer, because there is no single inquiry that's looked into it. We have estimates from the reports in individual areas, but we only really have those estimates for Rochdale and Telford. So that's 1,500 and 1,000. So we know there's at least 2,500 victims, plus all the ones in the other cases. And you'll sometimes see people on Twitter say there's been 200,000 victims, or there's been 250,000 victims, or 1 million victims. Those numbers are in my view, unbelievably high. But are people spreading those in a deliberate attempt at disinformation, or is it just people who are aware that there is a major crime that's happened, that it involved a lot of girls, and they're just sort of spreading a number? That's wrong. They should try and be more accurate, but I don't really think that's an issue, particularly if it's coming from normal people. Normal people will get things wrong. They're not experts. I think the real danger when it comes to disinformation is the experts, the people who are involved in shaping policy and in shaping the public debate. And when you look at some of those, the people saying disinformation are quite often people spreading disinformation. So you'll have people who will say that there is no ethnic element. Well, that's clearly not true. To have in places like Telford and Rotherham, a very small community make up such a large proportion of the abusers, even if it doesn't involve the whole community, even if you couldn't turn around like you wouldn't blame the entire group, you'd say that clearly there is a problem here. And it may be anecdotal, but it's anecdotal because the authorities have failed to investigate it properly. There was a Home Office report in 2020 into ethnicity and grooming gangs, but it was very deliberately nobbled. If you read the report, they don't use the Home Office data to provide new statistics. They don't try and interview the grooming gang members in prison. They don't really try to establish this stuff. What they did was they took a couple of pre-existing studies, all of which showed an overrepresentation of ethnic minorities, including Asians, which include British Pakistanis. All of them showed an overrepresentation, and instead they said, well, the largest group of abusers in our data sets are white. Well, Britain is a majority white country. It would be exceedingly unusual if they were not the majority. The key thing is whether or not certain groups are overrepresented, and if that shows that there is a certain issue. And clearly, from the information that they put in the report, there was an overrepresentation. But they didn't lead on that. They deliberately led on the largest group of abusers are white. And so that was what was reported by a lot of press, and it's been used ever since to try and shut the conversation down by just saying, there's nothing to see here, nothing to see. Nobody has, to my knowledge, shown an example of a white gang that would fit the same pattern as these grooming gangs, by which I mean a collection of friends and family who are doing on-street grooming, who are abusing girls of another community with a tremendously high level of sadism, and who are doing it on an extreme scale. I have not seen that. Obviously, there are white pedophiles, obviously, there are white gangs, those exist, but I've not seen this. And I'm sure if that existed, if there was a white gang out there that was abusing Asian girls, Pakistani or British girls on a massive scale, we would have seen it in the papers. There may be one or two, but I've never seen anything on that scale. So that was an official attempt to shape the conversation and to basically make the issue go away. And I think that's a lot more serious than whether some people are sort of making silly numbers online. That for me is far more dangerous.
And now that this has come to light again, how are the politicians responding? And are they responding any differently now than they did in the past? Do you see a positive change or?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think in 2014, one of the differences was that there was a much more, the horror that people had because it was so fresh was newer. So across the parties, there was a much greater degree of unity in being horrified by this. And in fact, some of the biggest, one of the biggest advocates of going after grooming gangs was a Labour MP from the left at that period. There had previously been another Labour MP who'd also tried to tackle this issue. That has changed. And I think, again, it's partly this process of people trying to make the issue go away. Now it's very divided. It's very clearly a right-left issue. We just had a vote very recently on whether or not there should be a national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. And the Labour Party, the left, voted against it. There was a whip. So they were told by their leadership, you must vote against this. And on the other hand, the Conservatives and Reform, the right-wing parties, voted to have one. So I think it's become a much more divided. It's become a much more serious issue in that regard. And you've also seen more people on the left who are taking the sort of denial angle, who are saying, we've had these reports, like the Home Office report for 2020, there's no issue there. They're not looking any deeper into it. They're not realizing that actually, when you look at the statistics, the conclusions that have been come to are fixed. They've not realized that this is actually an attempt to shape the debate and it's a misuse of the evidence. They're just reacting instinctively. So currently the debate is about whether we should have a national inquiry. We're not going to have one now because it's been voted down. The Reform Party have said that they will do their own independent inquiry. They can do that. There will be major issues because without the backing of being statutory inquiry, they'll have no real power to force any councils to do anything, to give them any information, or police forces to give them information. Although there are things that they can do. There's a lot of evidence out there. You could take what's there, you could reanalyze it, and you could show that there is enough evidence to show that there's an issue, or to get some better estimate. But it would then be a sort of springboard for saying, clearly we can see there's a problem. Clearly we can see that this is still going on. We need to have a proper inquiry. So it would just be a springboard for a proper one later on. The big question is what happens now? Elon Musk, who's done a lot of the work in promoting these stories and taking the stories that had come out previously and then promoting them on X, formerly Twitter. He doesn't seem to have lost interest. He's still tweeting about the grooming gangs. He's still tweeting about the fact that, in his view, the British government is negligent and failing to do anything. So long as he stays interested, I think it will stay a story. I think there is a lot more to come out. There's a lot of stories that have never fully been told, and people are starting to look into this. So one of the things that's happening at the moment is there are court transcripts of these cases, and those are held by the government, and you can request them. It's a slightly tricky process, but you can request them and get the full transcript, but it has to then be transcribed by an official transcriber, which is very expensive because you're only allowed to use the ones that the state picks. So as a result, we actually don't know what happened in a lot of the trials, unless there was a journalist there who reported on it. And in some cases there weren't, or in some cases the trial reporting is quite brief. We don't actually know the details. And so people have raised a large sum of money, they've crowdfunded a large sum of money, and they've started trying to find these transcripts, and they're going to try and buy them and then publish them. So I think when those get published, that could be quite electric. I don't think the story's going to go away. The question really is just what happens. The Labour government that we have at the moment does not want to touch the issue. As far as they're concerned, there was an independent inquiry into child sex abuse that finished a couple of years ago. That's all that needs to be said. even though that independent inquiry didn't really look at grooming gangs. It included them in one thematic report and then barely included them at all in the final report, even though they're the worst child sex abuse cases in Britain in the 21st century. But I think people are very upset and they're going to keep pursuing the story. And so long as they keep pursuing the story, and so long as it keeps going on and new cases and new victims are found, it's going to be there.
Thank you, Guy Dampier, Senior Researcher with Legatum Institute and co-creator of the documentary Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.